On television sets, colleagues respectfully called Phil Hartman the glue, the man capable of saving any failing script and holding together the most volatile personalities in Hollywood. He delivered laughter to millions of American families, yet he was completely powerless against the disaster unfolding inside his own home. On the night of May 27, 1998, instead of confronting his wife Bryn's escalating instability, Phil relied on his usual coping mechanism. He turned his back, locked the master bedroom door, and went to sleep to avoid the conflict. Hours later, a sudden deafening sound echoed through the Encino estate. The comedy legend's life ended right on his own bed, taken by the very woman he had married. When the news broke later that morning, broadcast networks immediately interrupted their regular programming. Anchors struggled to maintain their professional composure as they delivered the bulletin to a stunned nation. The American public was confronted with an impossible paradox. Hollywood essentially ceased operations for the day, paralyzed by a collective inability to process the information. The central question echoed across studios and living rooms alike. How does a man completely devoid of enemies, widely recognized as the most affable, reliable performer in the industry, meet such a devastating end? Philip Edward Hartman was born on September 24, 1948, in the industrial city of Brantford, Ontario. He was the fourth of 8 children in a bustling working-class Catholic household. When he was 10 years old, the family relocated to the United States, eventually settling in the diverse cultural landscape of California. This early transition, moving from a quiet Canadian town to the vastness of the American West Coast, required a certain level of quiet observation. It was during these formative years that he began to develop his innate ability to watch people, a skill that would later define his entire career. Before he ever considered stepping onto a stage, he pursued a highly technical and disciplined path in the visual arts. He enrolled at California State University, Northridge, where he studied graphic design. His meticulous nature and sharp eye for detail quickly translated into a successful professional career outside of performing. Throughout the 1970s, he operated his own graphic arts business, creating over 40 album covers for prominent musical acts. He designed the iconic stylized artwork for the band America's Greatest Hits compilation, as well as the stylized logo for the country rock group Poco. This period established a crucial aspect of his personality. He was a craftsman who took pride in the execution of his work rather than seeking the spotlight for himself. His transition into performance was neither sudden nor driven by a desperate need for fame. At the age of 27, he quietly enrolled in evening classes at the Groundlings, a renowned improvisational comedy troupe in Los Angeles. He paid for his classes by redesigning the theater's logo and merchandise. It was within this highly collaborative environment that his unique genius began to materialize. He avoided fighting for stage time. He preferred to observe the mechanics of a scene, figuring out exactly what was missing, and providing it with absolute precision. During his time at the Groundlings, he forged a significant creative partnership with fellow performer Paul Reubens. Together, they developed the stage show that would eventually introduce the character Pee Wee Herman to the world. He co-wrote the feature film Pee Wee's Big Adventure, and frequently appeared alongside Reubens as the gruff, unamused Captain Carl. This collaboration proved his ability to construct an entirely bizarre universe and play the grounded, serious counterweight to an eccentric lead. He understood that comedy required a stable foundation to function, and he was perfectly content being that foundation rather than the primary attraction. This specialized skill set led to his defining professional chapter when he joined the cast of Saturday Night Live in 1986. At the time, the legendary sketch show was undergoing a turbulent period of transition, struggling to find its footing with a new ensemble. He arrived in New York not as a fresh-faced amateur, but as a seasoned 38-year-old professional who understood the brutal logistics of live television. Over the course of 8 seasons, he became the structural integrity of the entire broadcast. Creator Lorne Michaels and the writing staff quickly recognized that he possessed a rare, almost mechanical ability to save any failing sketch from disaster. His colleagues bestowed upon him the nickname the Glue. In the chaotic, ego-driven environment of Studio 8H, where performers routinely battled for screen time, he was the anomaly. He was the actor who held the volatile elements together, the reliable professional who never stumbled over a line and never broke character. He created over 70 distinct personas and delivered a series of masterful impersonations, capturing the essence of figures like Bill Clinton, Ronald Reagan, and Frank Sinatra. His performance as the unfrozen caveman lawyer remains a masterclass in deadpan delivery. Despite dominating the screen, he never made the scene about himself. His primary objective was always to elevate the material and make his scene partners look better. His unparalleled contributions to late-night television were officially recognized when he received an Emmy Award in 1989. Yet even with industry accolades and national recognition, his fundamental disposition never altered. Cast members noted that he would quietly read a book in the corner of the chaotic studio until the exact moment he was needed on camera. He would step into the lights, deliver a flawless performance, and then retreat to his quiet corner. This seamless compartmentalization made him the most valuable asset in the building. However, the very traits that made him indispensable professionally were the same traits that would complicate his personal life. The man who could fearlessly portray arrogant, combative characters, like the pompous radio anchor Bill McNeil on NewsRadio, was in reality deeply averse to conflict. Off the set, he possessed a remarkably passive demeanor. He required a tremendous amount of personal space and quiet time to decompress from the demanding schedule of television production. When faced with intense emotional situations or interpersonal disputes, his instinct was not to engage, but to withdraw completely. He built an invisible fortress around himself, choosing silence over argument and isolation over resolution. This pattern of behavior was well documented long before the tragic events in Encino. His second wife, Lisa Strain, provided a candid assessment of his emotional architecture. She noted that while he was fundamentally kind and deeply intelligent, he would simply disappear emotionally when a conflict arose. He would physically leave a room or mentally shut down, refusing to participate in the difficult conversations required to sustain a complex relationship. Strain explicitly stated that his extreme passivity could drive a partner to the point of madness. It was a coping mechanism forged over decades, a way to maintain an internal equilibrium at the expense of external connection. He had survived 2 divorces, largely due to this profound inability to confront marital discord. He treated emotional turbulence much like a flawed comedy sketch. If he could not fix it with a steady, reliable performance, he simply stepped off the stage. He believed that by avoiding an argument, he was keeping the peace. He did not realize that his silence was often interpreted as indifference, or that his withdrawal created a void that resentment would eventually fill. This deeply ingrained habit of retreating to a bunker of his own, making set a dangerous precedent. It was a behavioral pattern that would ultimately collide with the volatile, unpredictable nature of his third marriage, setting the stage for a domestic dynamic that no amount of television success could mask or repair. The fracture in this public narrative originated with Bryn Omdahl. Originally from a small Midwestern town, she arrived in California with fierce ambitions to transition from print modeling to television. When she first crossed paths with Phil on a blind date in 1986, the timing seemed almost serendipitous. He was just on the precipice of his massive national breakthrough, and she was eager to establish her own foothold in the industry. Their courtship was swift, culminating in a wedding ceremony late in 1987. This marked the third attempt at matrimony for the naturally passive comedian, and the second for the aspiring actress. In the early years, the union appeared to provide a stabilizing force, bringing two young children, Sean and Bergen, into the world. Those who knew Bryn during her periods of clarity consistently described her as a fiercely devoted and fiercely protective mother. She possessed a genuine warmth and an undeniable charisma that easily charmed producers and cast members at social gatherings. However, beneath the polished exterior of the supportive celebrity spouse, a profound and volatile darkness was quietly taking root. Bryn carried a heavy historical burden of severe chemical reliance that predated her marriage to the beloved television star. She had spent considerable periods inside specialized recovery programs, constantly battling an intense dependency on artificial stimulants. This was a cyclical struggle, an agonizing pendulum swing between desperate attempts at maintaining sobriety and terrifying descents into chemical escape. When she was clear-headed, the household functioned with a semblance of normalcy. When the shadows returned, the environment morphed into an unpredictable theater of hostility. The underlying catalyst for this escalating instability was deeply intertwined with the shifting power dynamics of their professional lives. As Phil transitioned from a respected sketch player to a prominent, wealthy television anchor, his public profile expanded exponentially. The late 90s sitcom boom placed him at the absolute center of American pop culture, fetching him lucrative contracts and universal adoration. Conversely, Bryn found her own professional ambitions repeatedly stalling, her auditions leading to dead ends and unreturned phone calls. The wider the gap between their respective careers grew, the more suffocated she felt by his towering shadow. The psychological toll of this proximity to immense fame cannot be understated. At high-profile industry events, aggressive photographers would routinely ask Bryn to physically step out of the frame so they could capture a solo portrait of the leading man. To the relentless media apparatus, she was effectively reduced to a decorative accessory, a silent prop standing next to the real talent. For a woman harboring her own deep-seated, desperate need for artistic validation, this daily marginalization was a soul-crushing humiliation. His soaring, effortless trajectory became a relentless mirror, constantly reflecting her own perceived inadequacies and stalled dreams. This immense imbalance of success gradually mutated her initial support into a toxic, all-consuming resentment. She began to view his dedicated fan base and his grueling production schedules not as achievements, but as direct threats to her own significance. The success that should have secured their family's future instead became the very wedge driving them apart. Her internal frustrations frequently bypassed any logical filter, manifesting in episodes of severe emotional volatility and terrifying rage. The sprawling, beautifully decorated Encino estate would regularly echo with the sounds of shattered glass, broken belongings, and aggressive verbal hostility. Her jealousy extended far beyond his professional accolades, bleeding dangerously into his personal history and past relationships. In one particularly chilling and well-documented instance, her paranoia fixated entirely on Phil's former spouse. Bryn composed and mailed a highly disturbing, threatening letter to the woman promising severe physical retaliation if she ever dared to make contact with him again. It was a glaring, undeniable warning sign of a mind slowly losing its grip on rational boundaries. Yet, within the secretive, image-obsessed culture of Hollywood, such alarming behaviors were often swept quietly under the rug to protect the primary breadwinner's reputation. Faced with this escalating domestic turbulence, the comedian reverted to the exact same coping mechanism that had defined his entire adult life. Tracing back to his earlier failed marriages, his instinct was never to confront a problem, but to completely disengage from it. He possessed an almost pathological aversion to interpersonal conflict, a trait that stood in jarring contrast to the bold, confrontational characters he portrayed on screen. When the verbal assaults began at home, he never raised his voice. He refused to argue back or attempt meaningful de-escalation. Through meaningful dialogue, instead, he deployed a strategy of absolute maddening retreat. When the atmosphere grew toxic, he would simply turn his back on his erratic wife, walk into the master bedroom, and lock the heavy wooden door behind him. He believed that by refusing to participate in the chaos, he was somehow starving the fire of its oxygen. If locking the door failed to provide enough distance, he would silently collect his car keys and drive away into the Southern California night. He would leave her entirely alone to spiral within the cavernous halls of their home, convinced that a temporary physical absence was the safest solution. As the situation deteriorated, the television studio completely transformed into his personal, impenetrable fortress. A network sitcom set is a highly controlled, incredibly predictable environment governed by strict schedules, written scripts, and clear directions. It offered the exact structural opposite of the unpredictable, emotionally hazardous minefield waiting for him at the end of the driveway. He willingly embraced punishing 16-hour workdays, volunteering for additional voiceover sessions, and promotional duties without hesitation. The grueling workload provided him with a socially acceptable, financially lucrative excuse to remain perpetually absent from the domestic tension. His inner circle of confidants and colleagues were not blind to the decaying reality of his personal life. They noticed the exhaustion in his eyes, the subtle changes in his demeanor, and the way he lingered on the studio lot long after his scenes were wrapped. His close friend and fellow performer Joe Rogan reportedly intervened on multiple occasions, urging the comedian to initiate a permanent separation. Rogan and others plainly saw that the environment was beyond repair and recognized the severe emotional toll it was extracting. They provided the outside perspective that Phil so desperately needed, practically begging him to prioritize his own safety and peace of mind. Despite these urgent warnings from trusted peers, the advice was consistently met with a gentle, weary refusal. He operated under the deeply flawed, though well-intentioned conviction that enduring the agonizing chaos was a noble sacrifice for the sake of his children. He rationalized that maintaining the outward illusion of an intact family unit was ultimately more important than addressing the festering rot beneath the surface. He genuinely believed his infinite patience and passive endurance could somehow outlast the storm, completely underestimating the destructive power of the elements he was dealing with. This passive survival strategy contained a fatal, tragic miscalculation regarding human psychology. By continuously avoiding confrontation and retreating behind locked doors, he inadvertently starved his spouse of the fundamental validation she desperately craved. Even negative engagement would have been a form of acknowledgement, a sign that she still held the power to affect him. His profound silence and emotional withdrawal were not interpreted as attempts to keep the peace. They were perceived as the ultimate unforgivable abandonment. The more he pulled away to protect himself, the more her resentment mutated into a frantic, dangerously unpredictable energy. In his desperate attempt to be the ultimate peacemaker, he unknowingly created an emotional vacuum that was quickly filled by paranoia and chemical reliance. He treated his marriage the same way he treated a flawed comedy sketch. If he could not fix the scene, he simply stepped off the stage and waited for the lights to go down. However, the complex, volatile realities of a deteriorating mind cannot simply be edited out or ignored until they disappear. It is a terrifying paradox that a man's seemingly limitless capacity for gentle tolerance became the very mechanism that accelerated a catastrophic, irreversible collapse. The bunker he built out of studio schedules and locked doors was ultimately breached, proving that avoiding a fracture only guarantees a far more devastating break. The entertainment industry in the late 1990s operated under a very specific, unspoken set of rules. Behind the polished television screens and the carefully orchestrated press junkets existed a completely different reality. This was an ecosystem that thrived on excess, where boundary pushing was not just tolerated, but often actively encouraged. The glittering gatherings of the Hollywood elite were frequently masked as professional networking events. In truth, they often served as unchecked playgrounds where dangerous habits were casually normalized. Surviving this treacherous social landscape is difficult for anyone, but for someone with a fragile history, it is akin to walking through a minefield. Bryn had spent the better part of a decade fighting a grueling, invisible war to maintain her stability. For almost 10 years, she had successfully managed to stay away from the heavy artificial stimulants that had previously derailed her life. This period of clarity was a monumental achievement that required constant, exhausting vigilance. It demanded a rigid separation from the very temptations that flowed freely through the social circles connected to her husband's career. Their sprawling Encino estate was supposed to be a sanctuary, a heavily guarded fortress, shielding their family from the industry's toxicity. However, the boundaries between professional obligations and personal safety often blurred during the busy holiday season. In December of 1997, the couple decided to host a festive gathering at their residence. The guest list naturally included a wide array of colleagues, producers, and fellow performers from the television network. Opening their doors to this high-energy crowd inadvertently invited the very elements Bryn had spent a decade running from straight into her living room. The atmosphere of the holiday party was vibrant, filled with the loud performative energy typical of comedic actors off the clock. Among the attendees was a prominent co-star from the NewsRadio cast, a performer known for his erratic and boundary-pushing off-screen antics. According to multiple first-hand accounts that would emerge later, this individual brought a highly potent chemical stimulant into the household. He allegedly offered the substance directly to Bryn, completely bypassing any consideration for her well-documented, hard-fought recovery. In a single devastating moment of fractured judgment, the iron wall she had meticulously built over 10 years was violently breached. The decision to accept that offering was the definitive turning point in the timeline of this impending tragedy. It was not merely a momentary lapse. It was the violent reactivation of a dormant, destructive force. The chemical rewiring of her brain was immediate, reigniting a craving that had been painstakingly suppressed through years of immense willpower. All the therapeutic progress and the fragile domestic peace they had managed to hold on to evaporated overnight. The holiday gathering, intended to be a joyful celebration, silently transformed into the detonation point for their family's total destruction. The true danger of this severe relapse lay not just in the simple return to an old dangerous habit. It was the terrifying combination of substances that began circulating through her system. In the critical months that followed, Bryn was already under the care of a medical professional, taking a prescribed pharmaceutical to manage severe depressive episodes. When you introduce heavy, unregulated artificial stimulants to a brain already altered by prescription medication, the results are physiologically catastrophic. The addition of heavy alcohol consumption to this volatile mix created an unprecedented, deeply dangerous chemical storm. This toxic cocktail entirely stripped away her remaining impulse control and dismantled her logical reasoning capabilities. The prescription medication meant to stabilize her mood instead formed a chaotic synergy with the erratic highs of the illegal stimulants. Her periods of paranoia intensified rapidly, mutating her pre-existing professional jealousy into a terrifying, unmanageable daily reality. She was no longer just a frustrated spouse feeling overshadowed by an incredibly famous partner. She was rapidly deteriorating into an isolated, chemically compromised individual, entirely disconnected from the grounding anchors of reality. Meanwhile, the man who prided himself on accurately reading every room missed the most critical cues playing out under his own roof. Perhaps he fundamentally underestimated the severity of the relapse, or perhaps his chronic avoidance mechanism simply blinded him to the escalating danger. He continued his grueling television production schedule, leaving a dangerously unstable woman entirely alone to manage an unraveling mind. He did not recognize that the substance introduced at that winter gathering had fundamentally changed the rules of their domestic conflict. The silent treatment and locked bedroom doors were no longer adequate defenses against a brain compromised by such an aggressive chemical combination. Even as the internal infrastructure of the household crumbled, the outward projection of their glamorous life remained stubbornly intact. This is a common, agonizing phenomenon among individuals battling severe chemical reliance in highly affluent neighborhoods. Bryn still managed to attend school functions, organize play dates for the children, and maintain the immaculate appearance of a successful Hollywood wife. This high-functioning facade made it incredibly difficult for outsiders and even close family members to grasp the true severity of the crisis. The ability to successfully mask the decay only prolonged the inevitable collision, allowing the toxic elements to multiply in the shadows. Behind the heavy wooden gates of the property, however, the reality was a terrifying roller coaster of emotional extremes. The mornings might begin with a forced, quiet normalcy, while the evenings rapidly descended into erratic, unprovoked hostility. The two young children undoubtedly absorbed the shifting, highly unstable energy radiating through the hallways of their massive home. The unpredictable nature of the chemical highs and the crushing depressive lows created an environment of constant walking on eggshells. The once safe sanctuary had been thoroughly compromised, turning every mundane interaction into a potential flashpoint for absolute disaster. The tragedy is that this specific path of destruction is painfully predictable to those who study the mechanics of severe dependency. Once a 10-year barrier of intense sobriety is violently breached, the descent is rarely a slow, gradual slide. It is almost always an accelerated freefall, driven by a desperate chemical hunger to make up for lost time. The illicit substances do not just alter the present moment, they actively rewrite the brain's entire priority system. Love, logic, and fundamental maternal instinct were systematically being overpowered by a merciless artificial drive that demanded total submission. The profound impact of that specific winter night echoed violently through the Los Angeles comedy community long after the final tragedy occurred. John Lovitz, a fiercely loyal confidant who later stepped in to fill the massive void left on NewsRadio, harbored a deep, unwavering fury over the incident. He publicly and aggressively assigned the blame for the catastrophic relapse squarely onto the shoulders of the co-star who brought the substance. This intense resentment festered quietly for years, eventually culminating in a highly publicized physical altercation at a famous comedy club. Lovitz reportedly assaulted the individual, violently slamming his head against a wooden bar in a moment of raw, unresolved grief. The accused comedic co-star vehemently denied any malicious intent or direct responsibility for the devastating chain of events. He maintained that he was entirely ignorant of Bryn's decade-long battle with dependency and the fragile nature of her recovery process. He argued publicly that adults are ultimately responsible for their own choices, regardless of the temptations presented to them in a social setting. This defense highlights the tragic casual negligence that often permeates the upper echelons of the entertainment world. It exposes a culture where devastating substances are passed around like simple appetizers, with absolute zero regard for the invisible scars of the recipient. The hostility between the two actors became a dark, enduring subplot to the primary narrative of the tragedy. For years, the tension simmered beneath the surface of the television circuit, an unspoken rift that forced mutual peers to choose sides. When the physical confrontation finally occurred in 2007, it was a visceral release of a decade of pent-up anger and profound loss. Witnesses described a chaotic scene where verbal insults rapidly escalated into a shocking display of physical violence. It was a stark reminder that the collateral damage of that winter night extended far beyond the blood-stained walls of the Encino estate. This persistent fallout highlights a profound systemic failure within the broader entertainment community to protect its most vulnerable members. The industry is notoriously quick to distance itself from the destructive consequences of the very lifestyle it relentlessly promotes and glorifies. The public narrative is always carefully controlled, minimizing the role of the enabling environment in facilitating these deeply personal catastrophes. There are rarely any meaningful interventions or systemic structural changes implemented to prevent the exact same cycle from repeating itself. The Hollywood machine simply absorbs the shock, replaces the fallen talent, and continues moving forward without a single moment of genuine reflection. By the time the calendar turned to May of that fateful year, the psychological damage was largely irreversible. The infamous Christmas party incident was no longer just a singular mistake. It had blossomed into a daily consuming reality for the family. The beloved comedian, exhausted and pathologically conflict-averse, was completely ill-equipped to handle an adversary that could not be reasoned with or ignored. He was fighting a ghost, a volatile chemical phantom that had entirely possessed the woman he had married. The ticking time bomb had been thoroughly armed, quietly waiting for the final catastrophic spark to ignite the fuse. The evening of May 27, 1998, began with a chilling facade of complete normalcy. The sprawling city of Los Angeles was settling into a mild, typical spring night. Bryn had scheduled an evening out, temporarily leaving the heavy atmosphere of the Encino estate behind. She drove to a popular, bustling Italian restaurant called Buca di Beppo, located a short distance away in the valley. Her dinner companion for the night was Christine Zander, a highly respected television writer and supervising producer. The two women shared a long history, having originally met during the intense, fast-paced years in New York City. According to Zander's later statements to investigators, the atmosphere at the dinner table was lighthearted and entirely unremarkable. Bryn appeared to be in a remarkably stable, even elevated state of mind throughout the meal. She casually consumed alcoholic beverages, completely disregarding the strict necessary boundaries of her fragile recovery. At no point did she express any profound despair, nor did she mention any impending collapse of her marriage. In fact, the conversation leaned heavily toward the future rather than dwelling on current domestic troubles. The women laughed, shared industry anecdotes, and even made concrete plans to meet again the following weekend. This seemingly mundane interaction serves as one of the most terrifying details of the entire narrative. It perfectly illustrates the terrifying capability of a chemically compromised mind to compartmentalize impending disaster. A woman mere hours away from committing an unspeakable act was comfortably discussing weekend social plans over a plate of pasta. The illusion of stability immediately shattered the moment Bryn returned to the heavy wooden doors of her residence. The vibrant energy of the restaurant was instantly replaced by the suffocating, unresolved tension waiting inside the house. Phil was awake when she arrived, and his sharp observational skills quickly registered the undeniable smell of alcohol. He knew instantly that the fragile barrier of sobriety had been crossed yet again. The silent resentment that had been building for months finally erupted into a severe, high-volume confrontation. This was not a standard, easily dismissible disagreement over minor household issues or demanding production schedules. The central focus of the dispute was her dangerous return to alcohol and her undeniable reliance on artificial stimulants. For years, the fiercely private comedian had employed a strict strategy of total avoidance whenever his wife became volatile. He would typically lock himself in a room or simply drive away until her erratic behavior subsided. However, on this specific night, the famously passive television star chose a completely different approach. He stood his ground, refusing to retreat from the escalating verbal hostility radiating from his spouse. Driven by sheer exhaustion and the undeniable reality of a rapidly deteriorating home environment, he delivered a crushing ultimatum. He clearly and firmly stated that if she did not immediately cease her destructive habits, he would file for divorce. This was a boundary he had never truly enforced before, a direct threat to dismantle their carefully curated public image. But he did not stop at simply ending the marital contract. He delivered a secondary consequence that struck directly at the very core of her vulnerable identity. He promised that if she forced his hand, he would aggressively fight for and secure full custody of their children. For Bryn, whose entire sense of self-worth was fiercely anchored in her role as a mother, this was the nuclear option. The television industry had already marginalized her as a failed actress and a mere decorative accessory to a famous man. Stripping away her children would leave her completely isolated, devoid of any meaningful purpose or leverage. After delivering the heaviest, most consequential boundary of their entire relationship, Phil made a fatal, irreversible miscalculation. In situations involving severe domestic volatility and chemical influence, experts strongly advise immediately removing oneself from the volatile environment. Instead of calling for professional assistance or leaving the house to let the situation de-escalate, he chose to stay. He turned his back on the explosive argument, walked directly into the master bedroom, and got into bed. He simply applied his usual coping mechanism of sleeping off the tension, believing the storm would pass by morning. This profound misjudgment was born from the bone-deep fatigue of a man who had fought a ghost for too long. He was physically exhausted from his grueling 16-hour workdays and emotionally drained from years of unacknowledged trauma. He likely assumed that the sheer gravity of the custody threat would finally shock her into submission and compliance. He completely failed to recognize that his ultimatum did not neutralize the threat. It actively armed the explosive. By retreating into sleep, he left a highly unstable woman completely unsupervised in a massive, quiet house. As the midnight passed and the early hours of May 28th approached, the psychological breakdown within Bryn rapidly accelerated. She was entirely alone in the sprawling estate, trapped in a relentless, agonizing loop of her darkest fears. The alcohol consumed at the restaurant was now interacting aggressively with the artificial stimulants and prescription medication in her system. Her blood alcohol concentration was later estimated to be around 0.12%, severely compromising any remaining shreds of logical reasoning. This toxic, swirling cocktail of chemicals completely hijacked her brain's ability to process reality. In her chemically altered state, the threat of losing her children was no longer a conditional warning. Her severe paranoia twisted his words into an immediate, guaranteed existential crisis that required a drastic, permanent solution. The resentment she harbored toward his effortless career success violently merged with the terror of total maternal abandonment. Sometime between 2 and 3 in the morning, she made a conscious, terrifying decision to neutralize the perceived threat. The dispute was no longer about a failed marriage. In her mind, it had become a fight for sheer survival. She moved through the silent hallways of the home and located a heavy metal lockbox. Bypassing important documents, she retrieved an item originally kept for the protection of their affluent household. She walked deliberately toward the master bedroom where her husband lay completely defenseless. The house was entirely silent, the quiet hum of the central air conditioning masking the sound of her footsteps. There was no dramatic final exchange, no sudden awakening, and absolutely no opportunity for a desperate plea for mercy. The act was executed swiftly and clinically, permanently silencing one of the most beloved voices in entertainment. His passing was instantaneous. There were no defensive wounds on his hands or arms, proving he never saw the threat coming. The man who could repair any broken scene on a television set was afforded absolutely no chance to save himself. In the immediate ringing silence following the incident, Bryn did not collapse to the floor in a fit of sudden remorse. The massive surge of adrenaline, heavily amplified by the artificial stimulants, kept her in a state of hyper-focused momentum. She did not reach for the telephone to summon emergency services, nor did she attempt to check his vital signs. Her emotional detachment was absolute. She viewed the man on the bed not as her husband, but as a neutralized threat. Holding the item tightly, she turned her back on the horrific scene and exited the bedroom. Her actions in the minutes immediately following the incident further highlight the complete collapse of her maternal instincts. She moved quickly through the house, entirely bypassing the bedrooms where her 2 young children were still sound asleep. The fact that the deafening sounds did not wake them remains an unanswered detail of that night. Without checking on their safety or securing the premises, she walked out into the cool Los Angeles air. She climbed into her vehicle, the object resting beside her, and pulled out of the driveway. The drive through the empty, darkened streets of the San Fernando Valley was a surreal journey into the unknown. She was operating a motor vehicle under the severe influence of multiple illicit substances and heavy alcohol. Her destination was not a police precinct to confess, nor a medical facility to seek urgent psychiatric intervention. She was heading toward Studio City, aiming for the residence of a trusted confidant to unload her agonizing reality. The chemical fog in her mind was only just beginning to crack, allowing the first terrifying slivers of truth to bleed through. At approximately 3:45 in the morning, a frantic pounding shattered the silence of a residential street in Studio City. Bryn had driven her vehicle through the desolate Los Angeles roads, arriving at the home of Ron Douglas. He was a long-time trusted friend of the family, someone who had witnessed the couple's turbulent dynamic firsthand. Awakened from a deep sleep, he stumbled to the front door, completely unprepared for the nightmare waiting on his porch. He opened it to find Bryn in a state of absolute, incomprehensible panic. She was visibly heavily intoxicated, her speech slurred, and her physical movements erratic. Before he could even process her sudden appearance, she blurted out a chilling, unimaginable confession. She frantically confessed that she was responsible for her husband's demise, her words dissolving into hysterical, disjointed fragments. Despite the gravity of her statement, Douglas's immediate reaction was not one of sheer terror, but of profound disbelief. This hesitation is a crucial psychological detail in understanding how the people closest to her viewed her behavior. Douglas was intimately familiar with Bryn's long history of highly dramatic, emotionally explosive outbursts. He knew she had a tendency to severely exaggerate situations when she was under the influence of alcohol. Looking at her disheveled state and smelling the alcohol, his mind instinctively rationalized her words as extreme hyperbole. He assumed they had engaged in another loud, destructive argument, and she was simply using terrifying language to express her anger. It is incredibly difficult for the human brain to instantly accept that a close friend has just committed an unspeakable act of violence. However, the illusion of a mere domestic dispute vanished when she reached into her belongings to provide undeniable proof. She then produced the physical evidence of the incident, its metallic surface cold and heavy in the dim porch light. Seeing it instantly shifted the atmosphere from a chaotic late-night visit to a grim reality. Douglas, acting on pure survival instinct, carefully took the item from her trembling hands. He secured it inside a plastic bag, separating her from the immediate means to cause further harm. Even with the physical evidence resting in his possession, a thick layer of denial still clouded his judgment. The idea that the beloved, gentle television star was lying lifeless in his own home was simply too horrific to fully process. He knew they needed to return to the Encino estate to verify her claims, But the logistics of that journey were surreal. Instead of driving together, they inexplicably agreed to make the trip back to the valley in separate vehicles. Douglas followed her car through the pre-dawn darkness, the secured item sitting silently on his passenger seat. During that brief, agonizing drive back to the house, Bryn's erratic behavior continued to escalate. While operating her vehicle, she used her cellular phone to contact another individual in their social circle. She repeated her horrifying confession for a second time, leaving another friend paralyzed with confusion and dread. The chemical cocktail in her system was still actively dictating her actions, preventing any logical assessment of the impending legal and moral consequences. She was driving back to a house of horrors that she herself had created just an hour prior. The sun was just beginning to cast its first pale light over the San Fernando Valley when the two cars pulled into the driveway. The massive, beautiful home looked entirely peaceful from the outside, betraying absolutely nothing of the devastation within. Douglas exited his vehicle gripping the plastic bag containing the secured item and followed Bryn toward the heavy front doors. His heart pounded with a sickening anticipation as he stepped over the threshold into the quiet, air-conditioned foyer. He instructed her to wait while he moved down the hallway toward the master suite to confront the terrible truth. When he pushed open the heavy wooden door of the bedroom, his final hopes were instantly and violently extinguished. The brutal reality of the scene immediately overpowered any lingering shreds of denial. Phil lay motionless on the mattress, the catastrophic injuries entirely visible in the ambient light of the room. The catastrophic nature of the scene and the absolute stillness of his friend confirmed the impossible nightmare. The beloved entertainer was gone, and the woman standing in the hallway was responsible. Panic finally overtook the numbness as Douglas retreated from the room, his mind racing to comprehend the irreversible damage. He located a telephone and dialed emergency services, his voice shaking as he reported the grim discovery to the dispatcher. The time was approximately 6:20 in the morning, meaning the comedian had been deceased for nearly 3 hours before authorities were notified. The dispatcher instructed Douglas to leave the premises immediately and wait outside for the arriving units. He rushed out of the front door, leaving Bryn alone inside the house with the horrific consequences of her actions. Within minutes, the distant wail of police sirens pierced the quiet morning air, growing louder as multiple units converged on the address. Heavily armed tactical officers exited their cruisers, quickly establishing a secure perimeter around the expansive property. The first responders were entering a highly volatile, unknown situation, fully aware that a severe threat was present and a suspect was still inside. Their immediate priority, however, was not apprehension, but to locate and secure the most vulnerable individuals on the premises. They had been informed that 2 young children were somewhere within the massive footprint of the house. A specialized team of officers breached the front entrance, moving with calculated precision through the silent corridors. Their objective was to reach the children's bedrooms before any further tragedy could unfold. This extraction process was a desperate, heartbreaking necessity executed with the utmost care. They located 9-year-old Sean and 6-year-old Bergen, who were abruptly awakened by strangers in uniform. The officers quickly bundled the children into their arms, whispering reassurances while rapidly moving them toward the exit. The tactical team took extreme precautions to shield the children's eyes as they carried them past the hallway leading to the master suite. The paramount goal was to ensure these innocent minds were not permanently scarred by the visual reality of their shattered family. They were rushed out the front door and immediately placed into the safety of a waiting patrol vehicle. The successful extraction of the children provided a brief moment of relief for the commanding officers on the scene. However, the crisis inside the walls of the estate was rapidly approaching its final devastating climax. While the police were entirely focused on locating and rescuing the children, Bryn had quietly slipped away from their line of sight. In the chaotic moments following Douglas's panicked exit and the arrival of law enforcement, she found herself unsupervised. The heavy fog of alcohol and artificial stimulants was likely beginning to lift, allowing the crushing weight of reality to crash down upon her. She was no longer a frustrated wife fighting a domestic battle. She was a woman who had irrevocably destroyed her family. The sheer magnitude of her actions offered absolutely no logical path forward. She walked back down the familiar hallway, retracing the exact steps she had taken hours earlier. She entered the master bedroom, the space that had served as a silent battleground for so many years of unresolved tension. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind her, and she engaged the lock from the inside, effectively sealing the room. She was now completely isolated with the tragic result of her uncontrollable rage. The police officers outside the door were busy securing the perimeter, entirely unaware of the final fatal sequence unfolding within. Bryn moved toward the bed, the very spot where she had violently ended the life of the man she once promised to love. She did not attempt to flee through a window, nor did she shout any final explanations to the officers gathering outside. She climbed onto the mattress and lay down directly next to the motionless body of her husband. In those fleeting, silent moments, the full, unbearable horror of her existence must have completely overwhelmed any remaining desire to survive. She had reached the absolute end of her agonizing, lifelong struggle with her own internal darkness. She reached for a secondary item that remained in the house, one that had not been confiscated by Douglas earlier that morning. She positioned the cold steel against herself, making a final, irreversible decision to escape the impending consequences. The silence of the morning was shattered by a final echoing sound from within the locked room. The officers outside immediately halted their operations, the unmistakable sound signaling that the standoff had abruptly concluded. The long, tragic saga of the Hartman family had finally reached its ultimate devastating conclusion. When the tactical team eventually breached the locked bedroom door, they were met with a grim reality. Bryn was found lying peacefully next to Phil, having successfully ended her own pain alongside the life she had just taken. The two figures rested side by side, a haunting, permanent portrait of a relationship completely consumed by toxicity and untreated mental agony. The officers secured the items and officially declared the scene safe, but the emotional atmosphere was suffocating. The house that had once hosted glittering holiday parties was now nothing more than a silent tomb. The sun was now fully risen over Los Angeles, casting bright, unforgiving light on the tragedy that had unfolded in the shadows. The yellow police tape was unfurled, stretching across the manicured lawns to keep the rapidly gathering media at bay. The children, safe in police custody, were about to begin the unimaginable process of learning that their entire world had been erased in a single night. The physical events of the morning had concluded, but the shock waves were just preparing to radiate outward. The entertainment industry was about to wake up to a reality it was entirely unprepared to accept. The broadcast networks immediately interrupted their morning programming, delivering the bulletin to a stunned nation. In Hollywood, television production came to a respectful halt. The creative team behind The Simpsons permanently retired the iconic characters of Troy McClure and Lionel Hutz, acknowledging that his specific comedic cadence could never be replicated. Over on the set of NewsRadio, castmates were forced to return for a 5th season without their anchor. They addressed his absence through an off-screen medical emergency, but the underlying joy of the production was irrevocably extinguished, and the series soon ended. The most devastating reality fell upon his 2 young children, Sean and Bergen. Recognizing the psychological danger of the Los Angeles media circus, the extended family relocated the siblings to the quiet environment of Edina, Minnesota, placing them in the care of Bryn's sister. To secure their future, Phil's $1.23 million estate was liquidated and structured into heavily protected trust funds, set to distribute only after they reached age 25. This calculated financial architecture allowed them to grow up with privacy, eventually forging their own distinct paths away from the public eye. Shortly after the investigation concluded, the physical remains of both Phil and Bryn were cremated. In a highly private ceremony, their ashes were scattered together over the deep waters of Emerald Bay near Santa Catalina Island. The industry lost a master craftsman, the reliable professional who spent his life repairing the scenes of others. The events of May 28, 1998, stand as a cold reminder that public adoration and professional stability offer no protection against untreated internal decay.